welcome to our event tonight. It's very nice to see all of you here. So tonight we're going to be talking about the links between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the current Great Recession. So a lot has been said about that, about the differences, about the similarities, but the focus of our event tonight is whether we can actually learn from our history, from the Great Depression, or whether the policies we should be implementing now to return to growth after the Great Recession can be borrowed, in a way, from the Great Depression of the 1930s. In order to discuss these issues, we've got two wonderful speakers, and our wonderful chair, Dr. Cristiano Risuccia, who's an economic historian working in the history of the 20th century. So I'll hand over to him, and Dr. Risuccia will introduce the speakers and introduce you to the format of the event. Thanks a lot again, and hope you all enjoy the event tonight.
Well, welcome. A full house. That's great. I've been asked to introduce kind of our speakers. I think that there's no real need to for an introduction. Most of you probably have pored over kind of the work in your first years. I see a lot of economists around, probably second and third year economists. Let's start with Nick Krauss. You kind of certainly kind of remember kind of and read kind of the extensive kind of works of kind of Nick Krauss, starting from the Ellen MacArthur kind of lectures. You could listen to every single kind of word that was kind of spelled in that occasion, and you kind of remember kind of probably the great debate with McCloskey on the late Victorian economy in Britain, and you probably remember also a lot of other things that were kind of written, and most importantly is kind of contribution to our view of the Industrial Revolution. With Nick Harley, it's kind of changed our view of that episode to one of a gradual kind of growth and the importance of technology seen as a more gradual kind of contribution to change. What you probably know less is that kind of Nick has been kind of writing on all sorts of other kind of topics, ranging from GPTs to train timetables in the late 19th century, and more extensively, obviously, on the Great Depression in Britain and in other countries. Nor, I feel that it's kind of very necessary to introduce Solomos. Solomon, you all kind of been to his lectures. He's also been working on the late Victorian periods, in particular kind of long cycles, and been working extensively on the interwar period, on technology and GPTs in particular, recent. And he's also, of course, kind of famous, and you would remember, kind of on kind of the debates on the role of tariffs in the recovery in the Great Depression. So I don't think there's anything more to say except that to welcome them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Cristiano. It's always very nice to come back to Cambridge. I was thinking this afternoon, it was more than 40 years since I first set foot on this site as a student. It brings back mostly happy memories, apart from some of the dreadful lectures I suffered in things like this. So we'll try and improve on the standards that prevailed then. The second thing that is good to see is quite a lot of people are here. The last time I spoke to a student society, the total audience was 6. 3 of them were asleep after 5 minutes. So if 3 of you go to sleep after 5 minutes, we won't notice. But it was painfully obvious on that occasion. Okay, as was said in the introduction, the historical perspective I'm going to take is largely from the 1930s, not entirely. So I'm going to start off by looking mostly at Britain in the 30s. I want to say one or two things that seem to me to come from that with regard to policy issues. But then for the latter part of the talk, I actually want to think about the 30s as the collapse of the international monetary system and relate that to issues in the Eurozone, where essentially returning to growth is perhaps still in the future, whereas perhaps in Britain we've more or less achieved it. So thinking of the 1930s, I see them as a period of deflation, slump and crisis. I don't mean those to be synonyms. Deflation is price falls, slumps is GDP going down, crisis is banking crises, financial crises, currency crises. We know it's a period of deglobalization, trade wars, the gold standard collapses, capital controls get put on in various countries, there's a lot of default about. And we know it's a period where the major powers find it difficult or impossible to coordinate economic policy. Something which people perhaps don't spot quite so much, and it's a theme to which I want to come back, is that it's a period where the role of the central bank changed. In Britain, and perhaps even more so in the United States, the central bank loses control of monetary policy. And I think this issue is in an era more generally, where central banks are going to lose out and become essentially subservient to governments. That's a point I want to return to in a bit. Again, I think most of you are probably familiar with some version of the macroeconomic policy trilemma. We know that generally speaking, you can have at most two of independent monetary policy, take that to be setting your own interest rate if you wish, fixed exchange rate and international capital mobility. The 1930s does see quite a big change in the choice that at least advanced countries are generally making. They switch from giving up monetary policy and having a fixed exchange rate in the context of the gold standard to dirty floating, or moving away from the fixed exchange rate and potentially at least having more control over monetary policy. And in countries like Britain, I think that did make quite a big difference. I want to remind us before we finish that after the 1930s came the post-World War II era. And the post-World War II era for me this afternoon is reminding you about Bretton Woods. In the Bretton Woods international monetary system, we go back to something which is fairly close to fixed exchange rates, but it's a period where capital is not very mobile internationally. And that's a very deliberate policy choice at the time. I want to think a moment or two later on about the implications of that policy choice and perhaps also why it was made. The 1930s was a period then when the international monetary system changed dramatically. More or less every major economy was on the gold standard at the beginning of 1929. Pretty much everybody had left by the end of 1936. In the absence of a coordinated monetary policy across the world, leaving the gold standard was basically, as I think we all know, very good for early recovery. Just think of the reasons why leaving the gold standard was basically good for you. They're there in that second bullet point. You got control of your interest rate, as the trilemma suggests. You could, in principle, now adopt policies which would be more inflationary. You could possibly even persuade people to be future inflation. That says you could do something about the real interest rate, not just the nominal interest rate. You made it much less necessary for money wages to fall to adjust to losses of competitiveness. And for a country like Britain, and I want to emphasise this in a minute or two, this improved the fiscal arithmetic, the problem of debt management, very considerably. And the thing that I want to come back to in the later part of my remarks is that if it was so good for them in the 1930s, wouldn't it actually possibly be a good idea if the Eurozone collapsed today? And if not, why not? That's the sort of question we might want to raise. Okay, and there's a little chart which is one way of showing that on the whole, if you left the gold standard early, you return to the pre-depression income level relatively early. Those numbers are basically Angus Madison's. Looking at the UK specifically, and thinking about relevance to today, unlike when I was last lecturing a lot on this in the 1980s, the focus might not be quite so much on unemployment now as it was then. Because now we live in an economy with a high public debt to GDP ratio, high and rising recently. Interwar Britain was an economy in which the debt management issue was absolutely central. And I think that's very important to understanding the nature of recovery in the 1930s. But we can also say this is an economy which has quite a long lifetime with interest rates pretty much at the lower bound. Short-run interest rates are basically around 0.5% from the middle of 1932 throughout the rest of the 1930s, and they were held down there as a deliberate policy. During that period of low interest rates, we see two experiments taking place. The first one is actually trying to balance the budget, call it fiscal consolidation, and that's the years still going on in the years 32, 33, 34. From 1935 onwards, we start to see rearmament, and then we can see actually fiscal stimulus being introduced to the economy, again at the lower bound, with interest rates being held basically pretty constant. There was a double-dip recession in the 1930s, but it was followed by strong growth. 4% growth would look quite attractive, I think, to Mr. Osborne and his colleagues today. One difference for the UK compared with now is there was no banking crisis, at least no overt banking crisis in Britain in the 1930s. UK downturn at that time was short and mild. The term Great Depression is a misnomer applied to the UK. It's rather like a nasty recession in the early 30s. In fact, fairly similar to what we went through from 2008 onwards. The UK comes out of that recession relatively early in international terms. It fits the international pattern, an early devaluation and no banking crisis typically equaled relatively early recovery. The 1930s are still very much seen as traumatic in Britain. The reason is, I think, the persistent unemployment, especially in what at the time they called Outer Britain. Since I come from Outer Britain, I think I'm allowed to use the term, even though it's no doubt politically seriously incorrect today. Okay, those of you who've looked at my works, and a few of you have probably from the introduction, will know I'm just obsessed with numbers. I'm an anorak, fully paid up anorak. Here are some numbers on the UK in the 30s. I think they make the point. The depression, the reduction in real GDP measured annually is less than 6% from peak to trough. Prices fall, they fall by close to 10% on the GDP deflator. There's a lot of unemployment for quite a long time. Monetary stimulus at the lower bound is an interesting thing to consider because, as we know, you can't cut nominal interest rates any further, by definition, if you like. The general argument then would be that you probably need some sort of unconventional monetary policy if you wish to try and introduce monetary stimulus. And we've heard a lot about quantitative easing in the recent past. I think the policy adopted both in the United States and the UK in the 1930s was more radical. I think that was essentially a policy of trying to reduce real interest rates by credibly committing to higher inflation. If I'm right, then a lesson that might come out from that, and this certainly might be applicable to the Eurozone at the moment, is that inflation targeting with a 2% target inflation rate may not be a policy regime for all seasons. In a depressed economy at the lower band, this might not be what you want. UK recovery, I've already said, was pretty strong. Insofar as policy was involved, I think many people would see the main policy in the first phase of recovery as being monetary stimulus, which probably offset negative effects from fiscal policy. Exit from the gold standard allowed that, and housing investment was probably a major part of the transmission mechanism. But here's a slide I would want you to focus on just for a minute. This policy, as many of you will know, was called the cheap money policy. I think it was, in the end, a pretty coherent framework. It took them a little while to work it out. By the middle of 1932, I think they'd done so. I think a key feature of this policy is it was run by the Treasury, not by the Bank of England. And the Treasury had a very clear ambition to raise the price level. And one of the ways they tried to sort of implement that was essentially with a dirty floating exchange rate target. Eventually, real interest rates became negative, I suspect, depending how you calculate it. It's a credible policy to raise prices because it is so heavily in the Treasury's interest to do so. It just makes the fiscal arithmetic much more attractive. It makes the difficulty of stabilising the debt to GDP ratio a lot less, as I'll show you in just a moment. It also, of course, didn't open Pandora's box in the sense that it gave the Treasury as an alternative to Keynesian proposals for deficit finance. That's what happened to interest rates on the Dimsdale sort of framework in the 1930s. You can see the very low Treasury bill rate, we've been talking about that. And you can see the real short rates, as conventionally calculated, do become negative in due course. They built a lot of houses, just to check by that. I made a lot of capital on this last year. I'm bored by it now. But I will just remind you that the private sector built nearly 300,000 houses in the peak year in the 1930s. If you don't know, it's about 3 times what we've been building recently. And almost certainly interest rates had something to do about that. And there are some numbers just to show I didn't make it up. Mr. Stolper made it up. Okay, so or at least Mr. Stolper produced the numbers which I borrowed to create that chart. I think it's quite unfair. He's dead, so he can't sue me. He probably didn't actually make them up. Okay, fiscal policy, I think we can see it in a sense as becoming de facto Keynesian, but that only really happens with rearmament, and that starts from 1935-6 really. By 1937, it's certainly true that rearmament is in full swing, and explicitly the government authorises itself to finance a substantial part of this expenditure by deficit finance, the Defence Loans Act. Rearmament is central to this second phase. It is a large fiscal shock. My own estimates, done recently in a couple of papers with Terry Mills, nevertheless suggest the fiscal multiplier wasn't necessarily very high. I'm suggesting it may have been less than 1, even in this depressed economy. You might say that would be a puzzle. Certainly many people think at the lower bound. There are good reasons to think multipliers are quite high, and we'll probably come back and debate that. But equally, the empirical literature tells us in economies with very high debt to GDP ratios, the evidence seems to be that multipliers are quite low. And it seems to be a world a bit closer to that of Ricardian equivalence. There are the fiscal indicators for the 1930s. The one I would probably particularly want you to just take in is the left-hand column with the public debt to GDP ratio. Notice that that at its peak is almost 180, almost 1.8 times GDP. Also notice, though, that it falls during the latter part of the 1930s. Notwithstanding rearmament, the debt to GDP ratio goes down, which is excited a bit of comment in the context of issues to do with self-defeating austerity. There's an awful lot of debt interest having to be paid in the 1930s. You can see the fiscal consolidation in the rise of the constant employment budget surplus in the right-hand column through 1933, and then you can see that policy reverses in the later part of the 30s. Just to remind you on the standard formula then for fiscal sustainability, if we define fiscal sustainability to be that the debt to GDP ratio stabilises, it doesn't go up anymore. Okay, so this is a steady state condition for the debt to GDP ratio not increasing. And what the letters say is that little b, the primary budget surplus as a proportion of GDP, has to be greater than the debt ratio to GDP, then the term in the parenthesis is the nominal interest rate, minus the rate of inflation. So the first 2 terms are the real interest rate, if you like, minus the real rate of growth of GDP. That tells us that as the debt ratio goes up, the required budget surplus goes up as well, except perhaps if you can manipulate the term in the parenthesis. Manipulating the term in the parenthesis is essentially what I'm going to think of as financial repression. Financial repression is usually thought of as the government borrowing at below market interest rates. If you can manipulate the real interest rate to be lower than the real growth rate, you can actually get the debt to GDP ratio down while running primary budget deficits. That's basically what the formula tells you. And that's essentially the position Britain found itself in after leaving the gold standard. So that is not the usual lesson that's drawn from the 1930s, but I think that might be quite an important one from today's perspective. You might also notice that essentially in this story, if there are falling prices, if you like, negative growth of nominal GDP, then this formula starts to look horrendous. So a very, very important feature for any economy worried about debt management issues is that it avoids price deflation. And that was, again, a key feature of Britain's exit from the gold standard. There are the fiscal sustainability data for interwar Britain, with one change of notation. Little g is the real growth rate of GDP. These are annual averages. The interest rate there is the ex-post interest rate the government paid on its borrowing. It's not any of those market interest rates. Looking down at the bottom, the 1933 to 38 average, look at the details if you want, but the average is the thing to look at, I think, tells you that the formula would give you B star, the required budget surplus, is actually negative 1.38% of GDP. In the late gold standard years, it was positive 5.7. That is a massive turnaround. Again, you can see if you interpreted the formula literally in a steady state way, when prices are falling in the early 30s, how bad does B star look? That is, I think, what they technically call in the tabloid press, eye-wateringly high. Never quite sure what eye-watering is. It's something to do with wearing too tight trousers, but perhaps that's passed me by in my old age. Okay, when you look at the fiscal arithmetic in the 1930s, it is true they carried on running budget surpluses after 1933, as you could see from that previous chart, but financial repression was certainly a useful part of improving the fiscal arithmetic. So, I'm afraid we spoon feed our students in Warwick. We stop every now and then and say, what have you learned? If you have been sleeping for the last 15 minutes, this is where you wake up. You can bluff your way through the rest, okay? First thing I suggested is that a message from the 1930s is that conventional independent targeting by an independent central bank might be inappropriate at the zero lower bound, especially if you're trying fiscal consolidation. The second thing I mentioned but didn't dwell on is if you can deliver monetary stimulus, you would like to believe there's a transmission mechanism to the real economy running through investment. Thirdly, I've suggested that although it's tempting to assume the fiscal multiplier must be high at the zero lower bound, I don't think that's correct. It may be high at the zero lower bound. I think it's a better way to put it. And lastly, I've suggested that financial repression is really very attractive when the debt to GDP ratio is high. If you want to achieve financial repression, just thinking forward into the later part of the talk, one way to make it a lot easier to do is to have capital controls. Okay, let me now switch focus and start to move towards the Eurozone part of the talk. And let me start doing that by borrowing this construct from Danny Roderick. It's appeared in many of his publications in one guise or another. I think the first appearance was in 2000 in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. Roderick suggests another trilemma, this time a political trilemma, in which you can have at most two of deep economic integration, the nation state, and democratic politics. So presumably deep economic integration is, if you like, a highly globalized world, in which there's very free trade, there's very free capital movements. Roderick suggests that the way you can combine that with the nation state is probably by taking democratic politics out of it and having a strict set of rules which constrain the nation state to the deep economic integration solution. The golden straitjacket, Roderick is of course suggesting the gold standard was a set of rules which played at least a big part of that story. The second way that you could take the trilemma is to say, well, we could have deep economic integration and democratic politics if we had sort of federal level government across the countries concerned. or the States, and Roderick suggests that's essentially how you should think of the United States of America. It is possibly what some people might think would be a future United States of Europe. You get away from the golden straitjacket by having a federal set of institutions, which would presumably include for the EU a banking union, a fiscal union, and so on. But Roderick suggests that what came after the Great Depression was something different from either of those. It was the Bretton Woods Compromise. We know the nation-state didn't fade away. We know that post-World War II, democratic politics, if anything, had a revival rather than the opposite. How were the two squared? Roderick suggests by giving up to some extent on deep economic integration. Giving up on some integration in order to save the rest. The Bretton Woods settlement was really about restoring the growth of international trade, and actually took capital immobility to be a condition which would make that more likely to happen. So, thinking of the gold standard and Roderick's trilemma, with democratic politics in the 1930s, it was much harder to accept the straitjacket, so the gold standard collapsed and was abandoned. The Bretton Woods Compromise was a new choice in terms of the macroeconomic trilemma, and it involves essentially fixed exchange rates with an opportunity for independent monetary policy, but capital is now going to be pretty immobile. I think the key thing for today to recognise is that provided policy space for European countries by changing the rules. And that might be another aspect of what could be done in terms of reforming the Eurozone. The Bretton Woods IFIs can be understood in those terms. I'm thinking there of the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, and the World Bank. The GATT was putting world trade together again, the IMF was policing a fixed exchange rate system, and the World Bank was compensating for a bit of the capital immobility. Now, turn our attention for a few minutes to the Eurozone crisis. I think we're pretty clear that this has already entailed a long recession, rising unemployment, and indeed spectacularly high levels of unemployment in one or two countries. There clearly also is a very high legacy from this crisis, or a legacy of very high public debt to GDP ratios. I'm going also to suggest that if anything, future growth prospects have been diminished, even though I'm not convinced that that's yet appeared in the general notion. It even seems possible that we might now be talking about a lost decade, or maybe more than a decade, for some southern European countries. Just one or two numbers to orientate our thoughts to this nearer present. Those are real GDP numbers, including the OECD's projections for next year. Only two of those countries are above the 2007 level next year. The Euro area as a whole, obviously there's some other countries not on that chart. Euro area as a whole is a bit below the 2007 level. So that's quite a lot of years towards a lost decade already, I think, if you can count. Unemployment, those are sort of standardised unemployment rates, projections again from OECD. We can see a couple of cases which look, perhaps the phrase I used earlier was eye-wateringly high. Perhaps this is more than eye-watering. Since I don't understand the phrase, I'm not quite sure. But it's certainly a big number, it seems to me. And unemployment in the euro area close to double what it was in 2007. Looking at debt to GDP ratios, these are gross debts, not net debts, so there's some adjustment you might want to make, depending how you want to do the arithmetic. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear these have gone up a lot. If you're unfortunate enough to have had the kind of banking crisis that Ireland has done, look how very fast indeed debt to GDP ratios can go up. It is much, much, much harder to bring them down again afterwards. So this legacy of debt is something I really want to get you to think about. Okay, I think it's quite important for Europe to deal with that debt some way or other. In general, I'm inclined to believe that the literature points us to the probability, not the certainty, but the probability that debt overhangs of that kind of level entail a growth penalty. You'll be aware of the controversy over Reinhardt and Rogoff's particular calculations. I don't think we should get too hung up on this. I think we should look at the general drift of the literature and the theory that lies behind it and say we would worry about an economy which has that kind of public debt to GDP ratio. Given that size of debt to GDP ratio, it really does seem to me that fiscal consolidation alone won't do. History suggests that you might need rather more than that. Aside from just running surpluses, and if you do the arithmetic, the surpluses required to get the debt down to a safe level pretty horrendous, some combination of financial repression or debt relief through restructuring or forgiveness is likely to be needed. Here's what happened after World War II, just to get your ideas focused, and here's what's tended to happen when big debt ratio reductions have been achieved without default. This is a paper which does the arithmetic of the formula you were looking at afterwards. Because of errors and omissions in the data, some valuation issues and so on, there is a residual component here, which means that the last two columns don't add up to the third last column. Be that as it may, I think we can nevertheless get the message out that when the big debt ratio reductions took place after World War II, the budget surplus component was actually quite a small fraction. A lot of this was due to the growth interest rate differential, to the growth rate being higher than the real interest rate. That, I think, reflects financial repression. And that's exactly the Reinhardt interpretation. Again, for debt ratio reductions starting from high numbers, that would be the third row on the chart. Again, the interest rate, growth rate differential plays quite a large part in the story. It is very uncommon for any democracy to run a primary budget surplus of more than about 3% of GDP for more than about 10 years. So you really are thinking, I suspect, that something else would be needed. After the 1930s and World War II, the something they had was a capital immobile world in which interest rate, growth rate differentials could be manipulated. So the 1950s and 1960s were the era of the Bretton Woods Compromise. The Bretton Woods Compromise entailed capital controls, and linked to that were subservient central banks. Not my phrase, Charles Goodhart's phrase. What does Goodhart mean? He means these were dependent central banks. They were controlled by their governments, usually by the finance ministry, and interest rates were set in this capital immobile world with a view to making the government's fiscal position easier, not more difficult. So I'm going to argue financial repression during the golden age of growth, really was a key feature of that world. It's something which would be rather harder to do today, but not impossible to do some of. So turning to life in the Eurozone, we know it's pretty difficult with competitiveness and fiscal sustainability issues. We could see a world in which massive deflation takes place, huge fiscal consolidation, eventually makes the debt ratio look better, deflates the economy to the extent that eventually prices and wages fall and international competitiveness is restored. But that would be, I think the technical term is probably a Pyrrhic victory, even if it were to work. If you think about what might make the deflation issue less severe, well, unlike the 1930s, we don't have various different monetary authorities which have to cooperate. One monetary authority could raise the rate of inflation and the rate of monetary growth, and that's the ECB. Modelling suggests that if they were to do that, adjustment in the periphery would be somewhat easier. But the 1930s experience surely says, actually the golden straitjacket, which is what the Eurozone's been operating with, is likely to be untenable. Devalue and default was the classic recipe from that period. Turn back to the political trilemma then. You could try strengthening the golden straitjacket, I guess, if you can think of some strict new rules. You could think that you might become the United States of Europe, banking union, fiscal union, federal democracy to address the democratic deficit. A bit of a problem there, I suspect, in that I think European countries are too heterogeneous to agree to that. You might disagree, but I think that would be very hard to achieve politically. People who think along those lines and don't go any further suggest in that case it hasn't happened yet, but the euro may well yet collapse. I think an alternative might be to say, well, possibly people could devise a new Bretton Woods compromise. Okay, let's think what that might involve, but as we do, let's just think about whether the 1930s is a good guide to what might happen here. Somebody's used this title already recently, which is a bit unfortunate. I think it's a jolly good title, and it was wasted on that airport bookstore volume. This is Chatham House Rules. Oh, he's filming it. Oh dear, I said it. I shall defend it as fair comment when they come and sue me. Just as I did when my book review in the Economic History Review was threatened with a libel suit. It's not defamatory of you, it's just defamatory of your tawdry book. Words to that effect. You might want to say the benefit-cost ratio, BCR, I mean benefit-cost ratio there. You might want to say the benefit-cost ratio as exit from the euro does look different from exit from the gold standard, in which case you're more trapped. Why might it look different? The question is, could you do it without bringing down your own banking system? Could you do it in such a way as to avoid really deleterious capital flight? I don't know. Until we see the experiment tried, I guess we won't know. Strong Eurozone countries probably want to prevent exit, much more than strong gold standard countries wanted to do so. The doom loop matters now. That's the unholy connection between the banks, who now own most of the sovereign debt, whereas in the 30s bondholders owned it, and bank balance sheets which are much larger than, relative to GDP than anything we saw in the 30s. So the banking crisis, which causes a sovereign debt crisis, or vice versa, is a real problem. Some people, including the European Commission, clearly think, hold on long enough and we can go to fully federal Europe. You'll have your own opinion about that. But as I say, I think heterogeneity may be an issue. So, if you were looking for a new Bretton Woods compromise, what might it entail? Well, it's got to essentially involve more policy space. Would have to, I think, involve some retreat from deep economic integration, and it might involve a subservient central bank. I've already explained what that would be. In the 1930s, countries which couldn't devalue or didn't devalue and found that they couldn't use monetary policy because of the trilemma, if you like. They couldn't use fiscal policy because it was unorthodox or might have caused a currency crisis anyway. Those countries, I think we know from the literature, were the ones most likely to be protectionist. So maybe protectionism would be part of some disintegration which would allow more policy space, and at least something could be done. I think we're already seeing creeping protectionism. Although financial repression 1950s scale isn't available, some capital market disintegration is possible, is probably already happening, and probably would represent financial repression. The protectionism has been recorded quite well by the Global Trade Alert. I can probably skip over that slide. Lots of rather murky protectionist measures being recorded by them and translated by me into some numbers there. Financial repression, I've defined it earlier, reduces the need for fiscal consolidation. Capital controls are very helpful. Subverting monetary policy is very helpful. But you can also get at it to some extent by regulations which encourage your banks and citizens to hold your own bonds, and by various forms of moral persuasion. Eurozone financial repression is restricted, but not by any means completely precluded. different sort of ECB might collude more than it has in subverting monetary policy. The fiscal arithmetic, if you don't start to use these unorthodox tactics, really looks, I think, quite horrendous. Trying to use budget surpluses to return the debt to GDP ratio to safe levels will run into austerity fatigue. The 1980s and Brady bonds probably tells us that debt forgiveness might be a part of the solution if it could be achieved. The most plausible way of achieving it probably involves collusion with the European Central Bank and manipulating the ECB balance sheet by having the ECB buy bonds from the affected countries and offer them in return indefinite loans. Not, I think, with today's ECB. So, you probably noticed I've got another lessons slide here. Goodness me, that means I've just about finished. This will be the last slide. You can wake up again. What have I suggested? I've suggested that in some ways the survival of the euro does look like a Pyrrhic victory. For countries who are trapped in the euro, this looks worse, if anything, than the 1930s. And that doesn't seem to me like a long-term stable equilibrium. A specific issue which I've given a lot of prominence to is debt and debt management. The legacy of the crisis is a very high level of public debt to GDP. That is potentially, for various reasons, a drag on growth. Dealing with it through orthodox fiscal budget surpluses doesn't seem to me adequate. I don't think that's going to work in the medium term. I think we will be finding ways of trying to create more policy space for individual European countries, and that's perhaps what I mean by the Bretton Woods Compromise. Nevertheless, those disintegration measures that I suggested, I don't think are good for growth. Nor is a high debt to GDP ratio good for growth, in my view. I think Europe is going to find it very hard, if not impossible, to return to pre-crisis business as usual growth rates. If you look at the current OECD projections, they rely entirely on lots of productivity growth for the period of the 2020s. That will come with market-friendly policies, with integration, not disintegration. I think we're pointing, if anything, in the other direction. Reform of the European Central Bank, a different sort of central bank. Remember that old British rail phrase, we've got the wrong sort of snow today? Possibly for today's circumstances, we've got the wrong sort of central bank. A subservient central bank could create more inflation and help the periphery by doing that. It could monetize some of the debt and therefore, in effect, operate a debt forgiveness policy. And it could collude in financial repression, which would ease the fiscal pain. But I don't think any of that is going to happen. So I think my overall message is this situation is still a big mess.
Nick has focused, we were given various instructions when we prepared for this. My talk is mainly not so British. I'm going to consider the global evidence on lessons we can draw from the Great Depression. So it's same aims as Nick. In fact, I'm surprised we ended up on approximately the same story towards the end. We ended up towards the euro, which is randomly happening, but interesting. So I'm going to talk about policy lessons from the 1930s. And I guess when I was initially asked to give this, it's something we think about a lot of the time, but I don't really talk about. So I think it's a good opportunity to express our thoughts. These are not ideas which are very clearly worked out, but I think they're important things that we should all be thinking about. Can we draw lessons from history? What lessons can be drawn? Now, we use analogy, homology all the time. It's probably it's programmed in us to use analogy and homology as a learning mechanism. And that affects our usage in terms of economics. So from maybe young, we learn analogy and homology as part of surviving, but it's a tool that's probably affecting us later. Certainly, why look at the 1930s? Well, the events we see today, the nearest analogy or homology we can draw is probably the 1930s. Alan Greenspan, when the events first struck, rationalized it. First of all, let's recognize that all this is a once in a half century, probably once in a century type of event. So to draw any lessons about what's going on, we have to go back. And the 1930s being the nearest, we tend to go back to that kind of event. We should be aware, when thinking about policy, that analogy is only one tool we have in terms of thinking about drawing policy inferences. You know, as economists, we use inaction, we use empirical analysis, we use a lot of econometrics. Analogy is one tool, we use deduction. I will argue, actually, we need to keep perspective. Analogy can get us so far, but it may have limitations as to what we can learn from this tool. Now, in terms of economic historians, maybe it's random, but recently they've had a big impact on policy formation, particularly in America. There I'm listing 3 names that have been central in the Obama administration. Well, not the Obama administration, Bernanke was in that. So Bernanke is an economic historian who studied the 1930s. He's also an economic theorist, but he's an economic historian who studied the 1930s, and it's had a big impact on his perception of how we deal with these events. So he's proved quite useful in terms of the analysis. And I'm sure, looking at some of his own statements, he has most certainly been influenced by the 1930s in forming policy responses to the current events. Now, Christina Roma is another economic historian, and she was appointed by Obama on fiscal and other kind of advice. Larry Summers was also involved. Now, Larry Summers is in brackets there. He's not quite an economic historian, but he has written on economic history. And they all have a certain view about how we deal with this type of events, like the 1930s and the present. And their view is probably we can manage these events. We can manage them by the right use of monetary policy, the right use of fiscal policy. So they're optimistic in that sense, that we can use policy to react to Great Depressions or Great Recessions, the most recent kind of events. Now, let's to get a sense of what kind of policies, let's use Bernanke himself. All these people have actually written about their thoughts. How do we analyze our policy behaviors during this period? This is 4 lessons that Bernanke has drawn. And these lessons are probably grounded in some historical analysis. They're not just, I believe in all this. It's probably grounded in some historical analysis. Economic prosperity depends on financial stability. These are his own words, so I'm plagiarizing, so I'm accurate. This is all correct. Economic prosperity depends on financial stability. Policymakers must respond forcefully, creatively, and decisively to severe financial crises. So the idea is, as soon as one of these events hits us, We must react immediately, otherwise we'll get locked into persistence, hysteresis, and all the problems that entails. International crises require an international response. So events like the 1930s or the present are global events. We can only deal with global events with a global response. History is never a perfect guide. Now that's his final lesson. Now, I think that's a very important lesson, and I'm going to return to that theme. For Bernanke, history is never a perfect guide. I'll come back to that because we should be thinking about that. Now, where are all those policies coming from? All those policy thoughts are coming from a conventional understanding of our economic history. So we do have a fairly, well, certainly a conventional view of what went on in the 1930s, what were the successes and what were the failures, and he's responding to that, as is, I've highlighted Bernanke, but probably Summers would come to similar conclusions, and Roma would come to similar conclusions. And I'll highlight a few of these statements again. There's agreement, I'm going to question some of this later, but I'll give you the agreement first. There's agreement that devaluation helped to generate economic recovery via monetary policy or policy regime change. And Nick has commented on this for the UK. And I think for the UK, I would agree perfectly that devaluation and monetary policy were very important to the British recovery. But there's more global evidence, and we can think about that. The fiscal side, until very recently, there wasn't actually much research on the fiscal side. But the Great Recession has led to a huge increase of research in this area. And here, we'll come back to it again, but I guess the accepted interpretation is that multipliers can be large during recession periods. Nick highlighted that in Britain, the evidence is suggesting the multiplier is certainly below 1 in the 1930s, so we have a case study where that's not the case, but a lot of this literature appeals to the idea that fiscal policy was a missed opportunity. Had America, some of the big countries, had they reacted early, we may have prevented the severity of this depression. Financial crises have medium-term effects. In other words, whenever a big event is a global financial crisis, we will end up with a lot of persistence, difficulty of getting out of these recessions over periods in the Reinhard-Rogoff kind of evidence, at least a decade, if not longer, it may take to deal with this financial crisis. And tariffs, I'm mentioning, I'm just the only time I'm going to mention tariffs, but tariffs are seen as a sign of a failure in international coordination and generally negative effects. So most of the literature will probably draw a conclusion, we shouldn't go that way. We should do everything we can to prevent that path. There may be situations, Nick is saying, it's a possibility that it may give us different kind of adjustments, maybe the wrong kind of adjustments, but it may be used to give us adjustments. Now, if we're going to use history to draw inferences, and all these historians have used history to draw inferences, we could go along this path and say, well, how robust is this evidence? I would argue a lot of this evidence, much of it is not robust. Whether we take the devaluation theme, the fiscal policy theme, or the tariff theme, financial crisis, well, they can have long-term effects, and we can think about that one too. But I would argue we have settled on a conventional view of the period, but it's work in progress. As far as I'm concerned, the evidence tells me all this is work in progress. I cannot verify a lot of these statements to feel confident. I can go to a policy advisor and say, do this, and we will get a better recovery outcome from evidence based from this analogy with the 1930s. Now, as an example, I'll show you some evidence. Let me comment on this slide first. So history has had a big effect on policy, but there's also another causal path where policymakers themselves can have a big effect on historical interpretation. Now, a good example here is Christina Roma, her work on America. And Christina Roma basically, in her analysis of the American Great Depression, argued quite robustly that the Depression is dealt with monetary policy. Roosevelt's monetary policies are behind the recovery in America. Fiscal policy was unimportant because her estimates of fiscal multipliers were low. She estimated them in a particular way, but certainly got low multipliers. And the recovery is basically explained by monetary policy. Once joining the Obama administration, there is certainly a rethink. And in her most recent writings, she's quite clearly adamant that fiscal policy was very important. It was a missed opportunity. She made a mistake. Oh, I'm willing to accept that. People make mistakes. But I think it's actually more difficult than that. More difficult because pressures of policy making have an impact on the correct interpretation of history. So her interpretation now is fiscal multipliers are large. America would have benefited earlier with this type of action. We could have avoided the length and depth of this depression. I don't think it's evidence-based. It's based on whatever. It is semi-evidence. There's a little bit of evidence in that direction, but not robust evidence to sustain that hypothesis. So there's a danger that we should not allow policymakers to monopolize our interpretations of history. They can use it as an analogy, as a way of arguing their case, but they should think of better ways of arguing their case than reinterpreting history. So I think we need to be aware of those dangers. Now, in terms of, I'll expand a little bit about how these general policy views have been formed. Some of you may have done the part one already, and you would know about Ahengren and Sachs, that the dominant interpretation of exchange rate policy and monetary policy in the 1930s is derived from this paper by Ahengren and Sachs, a modern view of the period, and that view is very simple. Devaluation gave monetary policy flexibility. Those countries that took that path recovered much better in the 1930s, and although the paper can be criticized by saying only 10 countries, the US is not even there, most research has continued to say, well, it doesn't really matter. We can look at the Latin American sample, we can look at bigger samples, we basically get the same interpretation. They may have only looked at 10 countries, but we can replicate. I don't think we can replicate the same interpretation. And this is the Ahengren and Sachs story, and it's a very simple one, which says, if a country devalued, so the exchange rate of 100 means the country does not devalue, an index of 100, the country does not devalue. If a country devalues, so it's heading towards the zero axis, it has better growth. And growth there is measured as industrial production in 1935 relative to 1929. So how much growth took place in those few years. And in general, they favor this negative relationship, and their main channel, although they do discuss a number, is monetary policy. You devalue, you gain control of your monetary policy, and you may expand, and you will get the benefits of growth. Now, and that's perhaps where people like Roma, Bernanke, Bernanke himself did a lot of this work. And one of his contributions is to look at bigger samples. Bigger samples only get approximately the same kind of inference. That if you react early, that's where his theme is, you must react early. If you react early, you avoid the depth of a depression, and you get a stronger recovery. You get the benefit of both ways, the better recovery and the depth of the depression. And we can see some of this in, say, comparative different type of zones in the 1930s. We can break up the world into the gold bloc, those countries that defended the gold standard in the 1930s, so continued with contractionary monetary policies, and depreciators. Here they're split up into, this is Ahengren, they're split up into the sterling bloc and other countries. But in general, if we look at our first column, 2932 or 2933, we get the result that if you defend gold, you have a deep depression, And in that recovery stage, you have a poor recovery. If you devalue either the sterling block or the others, you have a mild depression and a very strong recovery. So activist policy, the early response is good, and activist policy is helping you. If we, basically, a lot of policy responses could be based on this analysis, I'd say is not robust. I think there is an element of correctness to it, but it's not so robust that I would say we find an easy route to recovery by making this kind of proposals. One of the basic problems, Nick likes data, I like data also, one of the basic problems is actually a lot of these studies have only focused on a variable like industrial production. If we simply change the variable from industrial production to GDP, or GDP per capita, or some other macro indicator, we get slightly different results. This is a sample of countries, probably it includes about 80% of global GDP. And if we look at the industrial production as a variable for this sample, similar to Ahengren, extended to Ahengren and Sachs, we get their picture. Their picture is if I react early, the devaluers, the top line, if I act early, I have a low amplitude recession, and I get a strong recovery. If I delay, I'm part of the gold block, I have a deeper depression, and I have a poor recovery until the system starts breaking up towards the end when I get some recovery even for the gold block. So the conventional picture is built up with industrial production. If I change that variable from industrial production to GDP or GDP per capita, it disappears, or some of it disappears. And that picture is saying, basically, actually the gold block had a less amplitude depression in that early phase, and the devaluers had a stronger recovery. There is something to the story. Something to the story in terms of these 23 countries, the major OECD kind of modern economies, saw a stronger recovery somewhere from the early 30s into the later period. But I've lost one of those ideas that supposedly if I react really early, I prevent this depression. Now, the problem is slightly even worse. This is Ahengren and Sachs. Remember that smooth line, if I devalue, I have a strong recovery. This is Ahengren and Sachs for 52 countries. The same kind of plot. So we can criticize over-focusing on exchange simply by varied relationships. Well, actually, the difference is this is GDP. I don't think I can produce the industrial production data for these countries, but the relationship breaks down. In other words, there is something to the story that devaluation, monetary policy may have helped some countries. Britain is one such country where I think, and probably it's a much bigger group of countries that benefited, but there is also evidence that it didn't help everybody. There's a lot more going on. So it depends on things like initial conditions. Which countries had more growth of credit during the boom of the 1920s? Which countries had financial crises? Maybe a country with financial crisis is not going to benefit as much from a devaluation. So in other words, this is telling me there's a lot more going on than the simple policy conclusion. If you expand your monetary policy, you will solve all problems that arise. Now, of course, that still leaves a lot of room for activist monetary policy. I will not dismiss the idea of activist monetary policy, but I don't believe in the idea that there is a very clearly defined, simple lesson that we can take from the 1930s and just apply it and move forward and say, do this, and we've learned from our mistakes. Bernanke actually has this kind of language. There's a famous speech he made at Friedman's birthday party, where he's basically saying, the Fed made some serious mistakes. We have now learned from all those mistakes. It will never happen again. We'll never have this kind of problems again. I think we have a lot to learn still, rather than things will never happen again. So this is an example. Now, I haven't got the same details to give you on fiscal policy, but all I would say, although there may be some convention emerging that fiscal policy may have been a missed opportunity, that perhaps fiscal multipliers were larger if we used fiscal policy, if we had used fiscal policy in the 1930s, we could have avoided the recession. I would say the evidence is still mixed. And this evidence is more difficult to evaluate, as I said, because it's actually arising right now. Nick's paper last year, Almunia 2010, Gordon and Crane, I don't think it's even published yet, but it's ongoing. So there is evidence that perhaps for some countries, fiscal policy could have provided more stimulus. Whether we're going to need a lot more conditioning statements before we convert that to a policy statement about the future. Those conditioning statements could be, it depends what level of indebtedness you have. It depends what timing this fiscal policy would be. Gordon and Crane are fine at pointing out the US benefited enormously from a fiscal expansion in 1940-41. In 1940-41, it was easier to sell a fiscal expansion related to war. Politically, they could not have sold that in 1933, 1934. So, okay, as an ahistorical statement, there is some validity to that. Perhaps had fiscal policy in a country like America, which wasn't so debt burdened, maybe they would have benefited with a bit more fiscal expansion. But people like Roma are then generalizing that to be a general result. If we expand fiscal policy, it will solve some of our problems. Europe may have different kind of problems. It may not be feasible to expand fiscal policy. As I said, this is really work in progress. And another important study is this study by Almunia, published in 2010 on lessons in the 1930s. And what they do is have a panel VAR kind of model, trying to estimate monetary and fiscal effects. They end up finding very large fiscal effects, modeling the fiscal multiplier with military expenditure. But I think we would have to debate the econometric methods. We would have to debate basically they use just two variables, monetary policy and the fiscal, some measure of the fiscal side. There's no other variable in that system. Another paradoxical result in that paper is, for some of the time, they're losing the monetary policy effect. They're picking up a very large fiscal effect, but they're losing the monetary policy effect. I'm not sure what Eichengreen felt when that kind of result is being published, but there is a problem with what that paper is getting. So again, although I can find a result through analogy which might say this country or that country would have benefited, I would stay clear from giving policymakers very strong advice from this experience to say we can do this and everything will be all right. Now, all that is really saying it's sort of a sideline in my main conclusion. The sideline in the sense of really saying the 1930s have been used as a policy to form policy. Analysis of the 30s has been used to form policy. And I'm arguing we need to complicate the picture. There has to be a more nuanced picture as to how that recovery is coming about during the 1930s. And there's a lot more complexity than the simple policymaker stories that we are circulating. Now, here an even bigger question is, I would think, we need to think about the underlying theme behind what we're doing. Because even if we had the perfect agreement, let's say we looked at the 30s and everybody here was agreed that the 1930s is based on, had we had the right fiscal policy, had we had the right monetary policy, everything would have been all right. Could we sell that story as a modern day policy? You know, the question I asked there is, can history have lessons in a historical system? Well, a historical system has a time dimension. It's ever-changing. There's new institutions to deal with. There's new circumstances to deal with. So can I ever take a lesson from the past and really apply it in a kind of mechanical way to a modern era? And actually, the more I think about that question is, I don't believe we can. I don't believe that there are policy lessons. You know, the earlier statement is really saying the picture is too complicated to give simple policy lessons. But theoretically, I don't think we should or can give simple policy lessons. But I don't want to undermine my trade, or our trade. Our trade, I think, is still very important. And what we should be offering is not simplistic lessons, do this or do that and you will get the right policy response, but we should be giving historical insights from some analysis of this, whatever period forms our understanding of policy impacts, to end up with some policy inferences. Interestingly, as I said, Nick came to this from a different angle. We haven't really talked about this kind of things. And he's ended up approximately where I'm heading now in terms of discussions about the euro, changing institutions, new constraints. And in a sense, I guess what's driving us is the underlying thought that here is a historical system and it is changing. Nick is probably drawing a few more lessons than I would, but the system is changing. We're facing new problems. Now, in a sense, we can do the experiment sitting in the 1930s and looking backwards. If we were sitting in the 30s and saying, what policy lessons do I take? Well, the policy lessons they took were quite clear. Defend this gold standard for as long as you can. You don't want to lose this regime, because this policy regime has served us well. So they defended the gold standard for as long as they could. But sitting there, they were staring at the need to do something different. The need to do something different is actually your old system that probably worked for some time. It kept you going. The gold standard survived. So as in that sense of equilibrium, it survived. But what was needed in the 1930s was there was a kind of endogenous response. We need policy to do something about the state of this economy. We are unable to get out of the mess. The historical insight is not analogy. The historical insight is we need to look back and think about the changes that are taking place and realize that economic adjustment is not present in this interwar economy and we need to do something different. So, in a sense, pre-First World War, the gold standard survived. It was working not like a monetary union, but analogous to a monetary union, where there was huge labour migration. There were capital flows that looked as if they were stabilizing. There was trade adjustment to depression in national economies. There was even real exchange rate adjustment in periods of fixed exchange rates. Not everybody was on fixed exchange rates. There was some price adjustment which allowed some real exchange rate adjustment. So it wasn't ideal. And actually, it generated business cycles that may have been long, just like analogous to the 1930s, not necessarily the same depth, but there were business cycle fluctuations that were costly, but it survived, and because there was adjustment. In the interwar, all this changed. Labour migration, political decision-making, ended labour migration. So we don't have labour market adjustment on a global level. Overseas lending, international capital markets collapsed in the 1930s. So America was the key capital exporter, but international capital markets have completely collapsed. There was trade collapse in the 1930s, probably due to a mixture of trade policy, financial crisis, trade costs rising, but trade is not going to be a huge mechanism of adjustment for most countries. Real exchange rates, we know we're in a mess. We're misaligned in the 20s, economies, the gold standard, as it was re-established after the First World War, was not functioning. So the historical lesson, doing the same exercise from the 1930s angle, is we need policy. We need some policy, but we need some new adjustment mechanism. And that new adjustment mechanism was probably discovered by chance. Was discovered by the fact that countries were forced off the gold standard. They were forced to experiment with something new. But they did discover something new. They were responding to new situations and they discovered something new. They survived for that period. There was some slow recovery. It was not ideal. But and what we're trying to do now, we're trying to do the same thing. We're looking back and we're thinking about what insights did we learn. Now, of course, there is the 1930s is part of our time information. So I'm not dismissing, throw away the 1930s information, but I'm saying build on that. Take more empirical influence from a historical angle. Think about what's new in the current era and what might be needed in terms of driving new policy frameworks. We cannot rely on the 1930s to draw historical lessons for the present. We can use that historical insight. We do definitely need something new. The kind of points that Nick is saying. We need something new. And here I was running out of steam at the end. I was sort of jotting down to myself, so what is new? The kind of points I was making to myself is really the kind of points that Nick was ending up with. I think this time is different. Reinhard and Rogoff made a big theme of this. It becomes a book title, which is really implying that those who argue that each financial crisis, each era is different, and there will not be financial crisis, are really being fools. That they're not realizing that actually this is a repeating pattern, it's going to keep happening. I think we do have historical change, which does mean that this time is different. That we do need to think of different kind of responses to whatever is making this financial crisis and global crisis and euro crisis, this cluster of events needs to be dealt with innovative tools. If we simply look at the 1930s and hope that a bit of monetary policy expansion within our existing monetary policy tools, which are really inflation targeting at this 2% mean value, and of course, the policymaker, in reality, like Bernanke, is realizing that history is a poor guide. The policymaker has to come up with something new. But the policymaker can only work within their framework. So we have quantitative easing. So we begin to experiment with quantitative easing of various types to try and get a bit more monetary expansion with the zero bound. We begin to have forward guidance. Again, we're playing with the tool. We're trying to create more flexibility in terms of having an impact on expectations. We're trying to buy a free good. But maybe somebody out there, some policymaker above these institutions, may need to say, we need something new. And Nick was highlighting a number of new possibilities, but we need something new. And that's something new to deal with the euro crisis or to deal with the international coordination failures. This is enormous. This is enormous, but we cannot fool ourselves that just expand money, a bit of monetary policy, or even go for some expansive fiscal policy, and everything will be all right. So I think we face new circumstances, and we need new policy frameworks to think about the era. As I said, I'm not undermining my profession. You know, economic history has a lot to contribute, but the insight that economic history has to contribute is not going to be a mechanical one, and it's not going to come from simple analogy. It's not going to come from simply saying, oh, look, the 1930s is so similar, and they made a few mistakes then, but we can correct those, and then we float along on a steady path. We face a problem, and analogy should only be one of our thinking tools. We need to use historical insight, which is much broader than analogy, and we need to use a bit of deduction to say we're in a mess and we need to think of new institutions to deal with some of these problems. And it's difficult to think of the institutions. We know we are politically constrained. So it's very difficult stepping out of your institutions. You will defend these institutions for as long as you have to, basically, as long as you can. Because we regard inflation targeting at 2% a great achievement of our era, just like the gold standard was. And we're not going to sacrifice this, because the moment we shift that number, we may find it difficult to regain control. So we are institutionally locked in. So I believe there may not be simple policy lessons, but we should use history as a thinking tool to think about what is needed. And I think it's suggesting we need something, we need to think more seriously than simply draw a few analogies from the past. And my reading of Bernanke and my reading, I'm not being too critical, I think they face a hard life in terms of making these decisions. But when you read their analysis of policy, they're overconfident. They're overconfident that they can deal with the problem with the policy tools they have. And in a sense, we should expect that. That's what a policymaker has to convince us. They're not going to go about saying, look, I'm not very confident I'm running monetary policy for you. They're going to have to come across in that way. And I would say there are serious dangers with this analogy method because it leads people pick and mix the history. And it's not just with the 1930s. You know, things like, should Britain join the euro? But we have had Labour politicians pick on Britain's gold standard era as an example, why policy should not rush into the euro. They give us an interpretation of how the gold standard generated problems. These are half-truths. The policymaker who practices this pick and mix of economic history is the tool they will use, but we don't have to believe their tool. Because it's full of confirmation bias. All they're doing is simply looking at the past with some view of the world, and they will look at history confirming their view of the world. So we should definitely resist. So it's difficult identifying this, so that's why you do need serious historical research, because in the end, I think we should defend the causal structure of whatever happened in any historical period. I sort of believe there is a bit of objectivity there that we need to sort out. And maybe actually we're all contaminated with this, that we all look back with some contaminated thoughts of history, but we have to deal with that ourselves. And there are broader issues here as economists for us to think about. You know, I'm being critical of analogy as a method, but our standard empirical tool as economists is the stylized facts approach. Now, I have a lot of criticism of stylized facts also because I think this is analogous to what we're doing here. You know, we're trying to draw strong policy inferences from a particular experience. The stylized facts is trying to draw strong economic theory from an analysis of so-called stylized facts. They have very little empirical foundation, and they have very little evidence in terms of are they stable over time, what period are you describing. Paradoxically, stylized facts often turns out to be a bit of economic history. That's what I'm doing. I'm taking a little chunk of economic history, usually 1960 to the present, and thinking that's what I have to explain as an economist. Well, yes, that's what you would have to explain as an economic historian, but as an economist, maybe you need to broaden out your question. So I'm pessimistic that we can look at the 1930s and get very robust insights about the present. But as I said, I think it's absolutely essential to have a historical perspective. And that's not the same thing as simply saying I need a few policy lessons. So we're both pessimistic, unfortunately. We haven't given you any optimism. Thank you.
Okay, we got probably about 20 minutes for a few questions. First of all, thank you to Nick and Solomon for these two very thought-provoking presentations. You both touched on the role of economic historians and when it comes to policy making. And this is a question for Nick particularly. You seem to suggest that somehow the European Central Bank is in a particular kind of difficult situation. From kind of your kind of discussion, it seemed like you were kind of espousing the view that on the other hand, other central banks have done better. Do you think that kind of this is to do with the fact Solomon is clearly very kind of clear that this is not the case. But do you think that there's something to do with the fact that there's economic historians that have been, particularly thinking about Bernanke, that have been at the helm in this institution? Would it have been better had Mario Draghi been an economic historian?
I'm not sure, and I think I'll pass this supplementary on to Solomon, who probably has a much better idea on that. 2 points I think I would make here. One is that I think Bernanke in office has been fairly different from Bernanke the academic. If you read what he said about Japan and what the Japanese should have done in the 1990s, some of what he's done as governor of the Fed has been a bit of a fair limitation of that. I think that points to Solomon as being correct to say the political world matters. And, however independent the governor of the Fed is supposed to be, he's still looking over his shoulder at Congress and so on. The second point, perhaps more important point I wanted to make here is, okay, I focused on a few things that could be done to change the ECB. I think the more general point, and this I think would fit in with Solomon's probably quite well, is that economists who just look at a brief period of time, let's call it the Great Moderation or something like that, tend to have at the back of their minds there is one good way to do things: independent central bank, inflation targeting 2% or something like that. I think I was arguing something not much more than saying it's not really quite such a simple one-size-fits-all world. That what is the best regime is actually much more contingent on circumstances. Now that seems to be quite an important lesson to take from economic history, and I think it's along the lines of, I think, the more subtle lessons that Solomon was asking for, rather than simplistic generalisations. But he may say in just a moment, that itself is a simplistic generalisation.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether Draghi being an economic historian will make much difference. I think Bernanke has some historical insights, but he's again constrained. And Draghi will be constrained by the institutions he's running. So they can only play as well with the institutions that they have.
There's a question there.
Yeah, I think it's very wise your set of reasons for skepticism about historical lessons, or at least the policy lessons, but you still are in favor of historical insight. So I wonder, in both of your guys' stories, the dominant stories about the 1930s, the role that rearmament plays. What do you guys think about the role of military spending in the United States, both running up to the crisis and since, with the tremendous amounts of money being spent on the long term? How is that related to policy trying to deal with the crisis, if anything?
Let me start on the argument, if I may. We do have a story in the literature, and Solomon alluded to it, which is the one provided by Gordon and Cran, which argues that when the United States got around to rearmament, and they essentially say this dates from about the middle of 1940 in a fairly serious way. In other words, it's already well ongoing before Pearl Harbor, let's say, long way before Pearl Harbor. Their argument is, in the conditions of the mid-1940, there was quite a sizable multiplier. I think there have been various iterations of this paper, but one of the numbers that comes out, to my mind, is 1.8 in one of the versions of their paper. If that's so, then rearmament is quite important in pushing the United States from sort of a partial recovery, which has been held back by the recession in 1937-8, and most people don't really see full recovery until, say, 1941, maybe the end of 1941. I think there is quite a difficulty with their paper, which is it's not clear to me that the multiplier is particularly well estimated in it. And I'm not going to say my estimates for Britain are necessarily that good either. I think this is just a nightmare area. And I think there is a real problem in achieving identification. And there's a real problem in separating out the multiplier as conventionally understood from what I think the macro literature more generally might call anticipation effects. One might want to say that if you start to see a military build-up, and lots of adequate response seems to occur, is that actually because the private sector's anticipating further military spending in future? And that, I think, clearly complicates the exercise of extracting those rearmament estimates. I think in the British case, my recent research is tending to say I think the multiplier is lower than the literature previously believed. But even if you believe the earlier multiplier estimates, let's take my own former student Mark Thomas, who wrote a paper on rearmament in the 80s, he worked with a multiplier of about 1.6. Then the sort of solution you get, sort of number you get out of that, is that GDP in 1938 might have been about 6.5% higher than without rearmament. Even there, you wouldn't want to think sort of completely to give the story over to saying rearmament was the only thing that was driving recovery. And when I sort of talk to people in bars and so on, you do sometimes get a person in the street kind of view who says, they had to wait for rearmament, that was what made all the difference. I think that's over the top.
As in the US, there might be slightly more case. Irrespective of how it came about, whether there's an expectation that it will multiply effect. Probably a lot more.
Yes, I mean, if you're interested in recovery, you may not care about the difference between the two.
A lot more of the gap is closed by the fiscal, whatever fiscal actions may have been taking place. But it doesn't mean America has the same flexibility now. So perhaps high level of debt may be much bigger problem now than it was in 1940.
Yeah, I mean, in the United States in the 1930s, the federal debt to GDP level never went above about 0.5.
Is there any evidence that the high levels of military spending have maybe helped the United States in this post-crisis period, the way that high spending on military did improve?
I haven't seen the research.
No, I don't know.
Your instinct is telling you that it will.
Well, if it was so important in the 30s.
Another question?
Well, I would like to advise Cambridge students how privileged they are to have such a refreshing pair of lectures in agreement with one another and avoid the main Cambridge diseases, which are analysis based on party political prejudice, plus a determination to defend Keynes, whether it's classical, neo, or post. It seems to me that there are clues in what has to be done. But look at Japan, stagnant for 20 years. Germany is now considered to be repeating Japan's experience. I've been saying since 1996 that in Britain it's going to be exactly like Japan, and got Skidelsky to put it on his blog with some difficulty, I may say. And it's interesting that with the bleak position in Europe, that America is recovering. But it's not recovering because of creative economic policy. It's recovering because of gas fracking, which has reduced the price of gas by 2/3 and made America ready to export and competitive in energy. And that's the clue. The way out is competitive exports.
So
Now
is there a question?
The question is, I'd like to know what the speakers think about restructuring the British economy towards competitive exporting, rather than, as Carly used to say, taking in each other's washing for growth.
Well, let me take the most obvious sort of logical starting point, I think, which is to say, if you want to consider routes to recovery in which policy plays a part, it seems to me you might want to say it could be monetary stimulus, it could be fiscal stimulus, or it could be supply-side policy. And I think you're pointing towards the third. Supply-side policy has a lot of different permutations that might play. One can argue that it's potentially essential to improve productivity performance in the long run, to have a good and arguably better supply-side policy. In some circumstances, supply-side policy might have quite near-term effects, although a lot of the supply-side policies you can think of are probably more medium to long-term. The sort of near-term effect that I was promulgating last year, for example, is a bit different from the permutation you've suggested, but it seems to me that we do in the British economy have a pretty massive inefficiency in our housing market. We could potentially change the rules by which the housing market is run. One can imagine changes which would lead to a considerably higher equilibrium housing stock, and the process of adjusting to that new equilibrium would, I suspect, probably be both efficiency improving and in the short-term aggregate demand creating. And it's actually why that kind of orphan slide in the middle about my 293,000 houses was there. Clearly another permutation is, as you're suggesting, to move to something which is closer to a kind of industrial policy, or something which is intended to work especially through improving export competitiveness. If one can think of policies that have that effect in the short term, then those two can work, both to increase aggregate demand directly, but also think about the standard economics of it. If people are persuaded that permanent incomes are higher in future because you've got a better supply side policy, there will be some spending effect in the short term. In the Royal Economic Society lecture that I did last year, I argued that actually we did achieve something a bit like that in the 1980s with deregulation of credit markets, which actually had both those effects and then some long-term effects we might not be so happy with. So in general, yes, but I'm not quite sure what the policy design we would want to put in place to improve the exporting performance is.
What's wrong with fracking gas?
Well, if you follow my general line that I don't like lots of planning restraints, then I'd be worried about too much planning restraint on fracking as well.
But surely supply side policies, we're dealing with global problems, so encouraging trade, we're going to need some demand side policies to cope with the global problems. You're talking about national policy, mainly. So as a national policy, you might try and solve your own problems. But clearly we've got a global problem and we need global solutions. So global policy is also going to have to play a big role. And that global policy could actually also involve the euro. If it's going to work towards survival, it probably has to develop new institutions which allow the supply side to generate a bit more adjustment, if that's the way it's going to go.
But there's no lack of demand for competitive products, whether they're Italian or Mercedes or even Apple. The demand is there for competitive products.
That's a big statement.
Okay, there's two questions there. First is, yes, the man with the green job.
It's very unclear if you have massive unemployment and you have benefits, whether you have still demand, but that's can reply to what you were saying. I have two related questions. So you said that the Great Moderation should not be taken as kind of the model to what our policies should be now, and kind of we should also maybe try to think a new paradigm. So two things related to that. Firstly, do you think that the economics profession that did not have banks nor money in their models, this works well in the Great Moderation? Do you think this should change? The second question is more for Nick. And so you said about the ECB should maybe consider new things and inflation targeting. Would this apply also to the Bank of England? You say that you need some kind of a transmission mechanism. This doesn't work in England. Mark Carney recently said everything's fine. We should go back to like a world where finance is prospering and whatever, and maybe kind of thinking about improving transmission mechanisms in the UK.
Do you want me to start on that?
Well, you're asking whether the economics profession should include more realistic models. And the answer is clearly yes. which may lead to the kind of problems that modeling and prediction. Yeah. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Yes.
I mean, let me follow that by simply saying that although we can see that long period between the end of World War II and the 1980s, let's say approximately, when there were relatively few financial crises in Western countries at least, the long period when the banking system was pretty heavily regulated and rather stable, that's a bit of an outlier period looking at a longer perspective. So when we teach economic history, we do tend to have lots of stories about financial crises, and it therefore seems paradoxical only to have a suite of models which excludes that kind of aspect. Depends, of course, when you're modelling, what the purpose of your model is, and so on. So we always have to make some kind of shortcut. On the bigger question about the Bank of England as opposed to just the ECB, it does seem to me that if you follow the logic that a monetary stimulus can potentially be delivered by reducing real interest rates, and that has always been the sort of Bernanke, Woodford, et al. Sort of perspective, then it's ironic, really, to think of a combination of forward guidance and a lot of pride in inflationary expectations still being strongly anchored to the 2% sort of level. The whole point there would be that you want to unanchor the expectations. The really big difficulty, Solomon, I think, pointed out in his talk, is we've invested an awful lot of capital in the inflation targeting from the mid or late 1990s, and in normal times that may not be a bad way to proceed. And one of the really big difficulties here is what do you do in abnormal times? Can you return to normal after the abnormal? I think that's an issue we need to think hard about. Let me just pick a paper out of the literature recently which frightens me quite a lot. Gowdy Eggertson, in reflecting on the American Depression, a paper in the AER last year as opposed to his earlier one, suggests that if you're at the lower band, it's so important to raise prices that you might want actually to act on the microeconomic front. This is a moment when all firms should suddenly be allowed to have market power, Eggertson suggests. And he sees the New Deal as potentially doing exactly that with some of the rules which were brought in. And we saw something of the same in Britain in the 30s. Of course, Eggertson in the paper says, at the moment the crisis is over, we go back to normal. But is it really as easy as that? You see what I'm getting at? Once you've made the change, it starts to entrench its own interest groups and so on. Britain made that sort of move in the 1930s, and it took several decades to get rid of it. So the same might be said here. Those who think inflation targeting is really basically a very good thing to do. You've invested a lot of capital in it. You wouldn't throw it away lightly. You're really hoping something will turn up. Perhaps for the British economy it has, before you really have completed to throw it away. Because once you've thrown it away, you've sort of thrown away the innocence or whatever it is. You're in a different world. And what you go back to after the crisis is potentially problematic.
Yes.
Yeah, in terms of closing the deficits that countries now have, one thing as far as I recall that has only popped up in France was increasing or re-increasing the top income bracket, taxes for the top income brackets. Now in the 30s, I do know that, for example, in Argentina, as I was recently reading French biography, it was only 1933 that they introduced any sort of income tax after decades and decades of the elites fighting down that idea whenever it crop up. Today, apparently, for whatever reason, raising income taxes for the rich up to 75, 80, 90% as they used to be, just doesn't appear in the public debate. How was it in the 30s, and does it have any relation to today?
I think you're right that new things come on the agenda. If you're thinking that fiscal consolidation is an important part of the process of addressing these debt problems, then fiscal consolidation comes in a whole range of different permutations, fairly obviously. You know, is it expenditure-centric, or is it focused on the tax side? And then, of course, within each of those, is it current spending or capital spending? What do you do about transfer payments? If it is taxes, is it indirect taxes? Is it direct taxes, and so on? I think, generally speaking, we know that income taxes were rather lower in the 1930s, generally across the world, and subsequently. So the change the 1930s brought was probably eventually to a higher income tax world. Within Britain, we actually see 6 income tax changes during the 1930s, 5 of which were to increase income tax. But the income tax rates are modest by post-World War II standards, and they're not really paid by anybody other than, I'm having had to check, it's about the top 1/3 of earners, something like that, the bottom 2/3. Essentially what's conventionally thought of as the working class, more or less don't pay income tax in the 1930s period. I think the danger with fiscal consolidation is that you do it in ways which are efficiency decreasing. I think broadly speaking, you may have a fairness case for wanting very high rates of income tax. You probably don't have an efficiency increasing case for doing it. So the difficulty here may be that the sort of we're all in it together actually leaves a legacy of unfortunately calibrated fiscal consolidation. I think incidentally a further big worry on the spending side is we know that fiscal consolidations from high debt ratios historically have tended to focus quite heavily on reducing public capital spending and public spending on education. So those two are things which are not really very good for medium to long-term growth.
Okay, we've got one last question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could expand then on that in terms of income inequality. What was income inequality like in Britain it's kind of during this recovery period? What was it like now from 2008 to 2007, 2008? So I think there's a lot of economic historians who might find a connection generally between income inequality and the boom of the roaring 20s and then leading to income inequality and then high income inequality 2007, 2008. I'm wondering just in terms of how it affects the multiplier and spending on assets versus consumption.
Two comments then. The 1930s was still a pretty unequal economy in Britain. We're talking about quite high levels of the Gini coefficient, probably higher than we see today. So we're talking still about an economy with a relatively small middle class, if you want to think of it that way. If you then think about who does the consumption in the economy, the income tax payers probably do something like 60% of the consumption. That's according to Tibor Barnard's estimates for 1937. In that case, I think that's maybe where you get some of the clue about the conjecture I'm offering you about the multiplier. It would be to say that for the tax-paying group who do quite a lot of the consumption, they did, I think, in the 1930s feel threatened by potential income tax increases, and actually those did turn out to be the case. And that seems to me to get you to a world which is a little bit more like a balanced budget multiplier world than just the deficit finance multiplier world that we all learn about in sort of first-year math. So I think it is probably quite important to ask yourself what kind of households you have in an economy. And I think the really big message that I've taken from the reading I've been doing in the last 2 years is the fiscal multiplier varies according to your estimating method, perhaps, but I suspect it also does vary quite a lot according to circumstances. It's not all estimation error. Some of it is that the multiplier is hugely contingent on the situation. And that might again be a message that economic historians could quite usefully both promulgate and explore.
The inequality changes are probably bigger in the US. Although Britain is unequal, the changes
No,
are
I think that's surely true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, there is a very last question. But has to be very brief.
I'm borrowing just a short phrase from Dr. Solomon's presentation. Bernanke's phrase, international crises require an international response. The question is, do you think that in the current crisis, the future is going to be a collaboration and political negotiation between countries, or some kind of international experts dealing with this sort of problems in the future?
Well, we're already seeing pressure from America towards the Europeans to try and do something about their state because I guess it fears the repercussions. So I think there will be negotiations. And I don't think we're going to have a perfectly coordinated system. It will be regional coordination of some type and subject to whatever risks it could easily fail. Because these countries face different kind of constraints. Europe is concerned about the survival of the euro. America would like a bit more European expansionism, but it may not happen within the German model. So it's subject to negotiation rather than, it's coordinated negotiation rather than some sitting around the table. And think, especially if the problems are not, staring at us. In 2007-8, there was a lot of coordination by the system. So when the problems are very, very serious, we do get very coordinated responses. But as the problems drag on to be more permanent kind of differences across different zones, we're probably going to see different needs and different responses. So only through pressure are you going to get some coordination.
So political negotiation, not global experts.
I think we will have to be at that stage initially anyway.
Well, this could be a long kind of conversation, but I'm afraid it's 7 o'clock on my watch, and we all probably a little bit tired. But these were truly kind of interesting kind of presentations, and so